Everyone, and welcome to today's session of JTS's spring series, The Power of Emotion, Judaism and the Inner Life. I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement at JTS, and happy to have you with us today. Special welcome to anyone who might be joining us for the first time today. The emotion that we turn to today, or emotions, are compassion and love with Dr. Eitan Fishbane, who Tani will introduce in a moment. I actually wanted to introduce to you someone else today, a new face, who is a new member of our community engagement team here at JTS, Ellie Gettinger. And Ellie's our new Director of Digital Learning, which, you know, a few years ago, the Director of Digital Learning would be running all online classes. Now everyone knows how to run an online class, or at least everyone on our team. But we're really thrilled to have Ellie here to be working on a new host of projects, podcasts and videos and other exciting stuff that you will see a little bit down the road. But I'm introducing Ellie today because she's actually going to be playing me today. She'll be facilitating the Q&A. So just wanted to introduce her to you. And we don't have sponsors today for this session. We would love for everyone who's been learning with us regularly to consider sponsoring a session. This amazing opportunity to learn with JTS faculty. As you've heard me say before, we have 3 sponsorship levels: Chacham for $540, Tzaddik for $1,000, and Navi for $1,800. And there's information in the chat, and you can also email learninglives@jtsa.edu if you want to learn more. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Tani.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. So just to go over the Q&A for today's session, just a little bit of the structure of how the session will run. Dr. Fishbane will pause for questions periodically throughout the class. We'll also have time for Q&A at the end. You can use your chat feature to submit your questions to Ellie Gettinger. During the Q&A period, Ellie will select a few of the questions to present to Dr. Fishbane. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with either myself or Lynn Feynman. The sources for today's class were in the email that you received with a Zoom link for the session. I will be screen sharing them as well. So pleased to introduce Dr. Fishbane. Professor Fishbane is Associate Professor of Jewish Thought at JTS, where he teaches courses in the literature and history of Jewish mysticism from medieval Kabbalah to modern Hasidism. Presently, his scholarship is devoted to 3 main areas: the Zohar as mystical poetry, Shabbat and sacred time in Hasidic mysticism, and ideas of the self and identity in the Kabbalah. Among his books are As Light Before Dawn, The Inner World of a Medieval Kabbalist, The Art of a Mystical Narrative, A Poetics of the Zohar, and most recently, Embers of Pilgrimage Poems. Dr. Fishbane is a regular scholar in residence and guest speaker at congregations across North America. We're so pleased to have him teaching with us today, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Fishbane.
Hi, everybody. Really great to be with you and to be with you again, and to be part of this wonderful webinar, and to be engaged with so many so many in this community of learning that's been created, which is really just a special delight. I think that we would be remiss, and I also want to share my own kavanah, my own intention, as we're thinking about this particular emotion today, really thinking about what it means to study Torah in a time of war and suffering, and specifically to think about what it means to reflect on the spiritual, moral imperatives and meanings of compassion and love in the context of in the context of war and such devastation. This extends, I think, in ways we could say, is what is it to create art? What is it to create community? What is it to create other types of forms of creativity in such dark times? And what can they do to hold our hearts, which are fragile and extended to the people of Ukraine and everyone affected by this terrible crisis, and how we can channel the virtue of love and compassion, both in our intentions and in our hearts, and in the kind of activism and tzedakah that we can effectuate to try in our small ways to relieve some of that pain. So let us have this reflection on today, and particularly this emotion be dedicated, and to bear in mind and in heart and in soul all those who are so vulnerable and in such a precarious position right now. The core question that I want to explore with you today is really how emotion in general, and specifically the emotion, or the twin emotions, or the related emotions of compassion and love are understood by various mystics, and particularly two mystics that we're going to look at today, two Kabbalists from the 16th to the early 17th century, especially in Tzfat, Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, and in his Tomer Devorah, and Rabbi Isaiah Horowitz in his Shla, Shnei Luchot Habrit, means the two tablets of the covenant. Tomer Devorah means the palm tree of Deborah. Specifically as to how they understood emotion and the cultivation of dimensions of character, and in this case specifically that of compassion, of rachamim, and very much of love, ahava, in a broader sense, how they understood those to be a kind of dynamic living relationship between the human being and the divine, or even more specifically, how in our efforts to cultivate Tzelem Elohim, to cultivate and to live up to our having been created in the image of God, or so the tradition tells us, right? How we can embody, how we can bring that those elements of divinity and of divine life to be human manifestations of that divine being and that divine energy, and that it is then also reflective of our aspirations toward that ideal, toward those ideals of spiritual piety grounded in moral imperatives, and this is in the broader sense of how philosophers of emotion of late have very much tied questions of emotion to formulations of virtue and formulations of what we understand to be the just and the good. Of course, it's a multifaceted topic, as you're learning from others of my colleagues as well. But there I'm particularly thinking about the work of the important philosophical work of Martha Nussbaum in her book Upheavals of Thought: The Intelligence of Emotions. Just a light 750-page book from Cambridge University Press for you to for you to enjoy. But she's fantastic. But our question here really, and it's definitely related, right, in terms of how these emotions are ultimately reflective of moral interaction or the ethics of interpersonal relation. Here it's specifically framed, and we're going to see this in a moment in the Cordovero, in the Tomer Devorah, how this is specifically framed as us as human beings manifesting this divine ideal, right? So specifically, the Kabbalists writ large, and Moshe Cordovero as one of the major Kabbalists of 16th century Tzfat, which parenthetically was also this immense this extraordinary place and time in the history of Jewish mysticism, when there was a kind of flowering of creativity in a whole variety of areas, right? It's when Kabbalat Shabbat was invented as a ritual. It's when the Chadodi was written. It's when Yedid Nefesh was written, and on and on. And it was also specifically in this case, when we start to see the move toward what we can call Kabbalistic ethics or Kabbalistic Musar, the attempt to take some of the more abstract, perhaps, ideas of God being made up of 10 dimensions of reality called Sfirot, and contemplating how can I cultivate those dimensions as elements of my character, as elements of my personality, as elements of my psychology, particularly grounded in the moral principles of how I interact with others. And so this is especially significant in Cordovero addresses a number of different such virtues, but everything begins with rachamim. Everything begins with compassion, and to a great extent, that is what flows through all of divinity, is the ultimate energy that flows through all of divinity, and therefore it's the ultimate energy that we want in emulation of divinity, in emulation of God, to flow through our actions. So the highest sphira, the highest of the 10 emanations, the 10 dimensions of divinity in Kabbalistic thinking, is called Keter, crown. And it's called by a number of names. But specifically for our case, what's very fascinating is that, and Cordovero says this in our text, is that first sphira, that first dimension of divinity, contains the Yud Gimel Midot HaRachamim, the 13 attributes of compassion, right, which we recite especially on the high holidays, part of the high holiday liturgy. The Yud Gimel Midot HaRachamim, and it's found in the Torah as well, of course, right? The 13 attributes of compassion, and as we're going to see, it's that within this highest, purest, perhaps most abstract, perhaps most rarefied, most transcendent dimension of divinity is the essence of divine compassion, divine empathy, divine love in its purest form, before there have been any divisions, before it has flowed down and made space for a dialectic between chesed and gevura, or love/grace and judgment/severity. And a lot of Kabbalah is about the balancing act of those two emotions, both in the human realm and in the divine realm. But what I think is particularly significant and really quite notable in this context is that it all starts with Rachamim. It all starts with that first Sefirah, whose very essence is the purest form of Rachamim before anything else. It's just total Rachamim, total compassion, empathy, love. And therefore, just like the highest of the Sefirot, the highest of the divine dimensions, flows through all of the other divine dimensions, like the deepest wellspring of water from the infinite flows forth down through rivulets and streams to unite all the different waterways of the world and to reflect the oneness of the water of all the world, that is kind of essentially a metaphor for the oneness and interconnectedness of all reality. So fundamentally, the idea is that everything is one and interconnected, and that one interconnected force, to allude, I guess, a little bit to Star Wars, but we're thinking more in Kabbalistic terms. But if that helps, that's okay. And it is all interconnected, and that force, that energy, is fundamentally grounded in Rachamim, in compassion, right? Divine compassion that we then emulate and manifest in our lives. So just as God's being and reality flows forth from that compassion, allowing it to fill everything that we do, so that all of our actions can then be infused and inflected with that core emotion virtue of compassion, right? Which we all strive and struggle to live up to, right? Admitting our all too human imperfections. And that we strive to do that in emulation of divinity and aspiration toward that ideal. So that's kind of like the higher principle, if you will, that guides a lot. That guides what we're thinking about today. And what I'd like to do now is to actually to go now into a, as Clifford Geertz would say, a thick reading, though he was talking about anthropology, a thick reading of our text, or a close reading of our text, to reflect that. We might be in. I'm looking at the PDF. I think there were two versions we had. Tani, but we're looking at the one that starts with the essential Kabbalah section from Tomer Devorah. So probably in this one, it's there. That's good. Yeah, that's it. Exactly. We can. So we're going to start there. Okay. So in keeping with the minhag of the webinar, with the custom of the webinar, as I'm told, and because when you have a few hundred people on a call, asking people to read is not necessarily the best way to go. So I'll represent you as reader in this particular moment. So he's talking about imitate your creator, which is essentially like right, imitatio Dei in Latin, or the way the Christians would articulate it, or live up, be like B'Tselem Elohim, right? Try to live in the image of God. But here it's about imitate your creator in the sense of really imitate has a kind of pejorative perhaps tone, right? It's more like emulate these virtues of God. then you will be, and let me just say one word, I'm sorry, about this book, The Palm Tree of Deborah, Tomer Devorah. So this book is actually an interesting anomaly among Moshe Cordevero's works. He really was a kind of very scholastic mystic, kind of like the Thomas Aquinas of Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism. He wrote a tremendous amount, a lot of which is very metaphysical and somewhat abstract, which some of us enjoy very much, but this was also the kind of a turning point and a kind of keystone in some ways, or a cornerstone in the growth and flourishing of what I mentioned earlier about the flowering of Kabbalistic ethics, and a number of much longer works followed by other people influenced by this, and it influenced many others in the centuries to come. Then, to emulate or imitate your creator, then you will enter the mystery of the supernal form. You will enter the mystery of the supernal form, meaning the mystery of God, the divine image in which you were created. If you resemble the divine in body but not in action, you distort the form. People will say of you, a lovely form whose deeds are ugly. For the essence of the divine image is action. This is a very interesting point, right? The essence of the divine image is action, right? How do I put these, or this image of God in this sense is actually emulating these virtues and putting them into action in our lives by cultivating certain emotions that then correspondingly reflect certain moral goods or certain moral ideals. What good is it if your anatomy corresponds to the supernal form, and that's another whole question which we'll leave aside. But the whole idea of the body as reflective of the divine, which was torn down to some extent by Maimonides and his later interpreters, was recaptured by the Kabbalists in their mythology, and it's a very metaphysically embodied reality of God, right? It's not that God is, we're describing God as anthropomorphic, but we are, here's the word of the day, theomorphic. We are forms that reflect the theo, that reflect God, right? The morphology. Okay. Leave that aside. Let that tantalize the corners of your mind for a minute. Okay. But what good is if your anatomy corresponds to the supernal form while your actions do not resemble God's? Okay, so in here, now we're coming back in this next sentence to what I was talking about before. So imitate or emulate the acts of Keter, which I mentioned, right? That's literally means crown. That's the highest of these 10 dimensions of divinity, all of which is part of the one God, right? And the Kabbalists will never tire of telling us that the 10 are one, the one is 10, the 10 is one, right? And that it's the ultimate heresy in their view to think about the 10 as separate dimensions, but still they want to talk about the 10. So right, so it's this intense dialectic. So the acts of Keter, imitate the acts of Keter, the 13 qualities of compassion, right? The Yud Gimel Midot HaRachamim, alluded to by the prophet Micha, right? Who is a God like you, delighting in love. You will again have compassion upon us. You will hurl all our sins into the depths of the sea. So this cultivation, ultimately, which he's going to go on to talk about now in more in terms of the human, is how do I seek to resemble or bring into my human existence this reality of God that flows ultimately through everything. This Yud Midot HaRachamim flows through everything. Let every action that I undertake, just as God is that way, let every action that I undertake right, and this is of course aspirational because we can never be perfect, but we're working toward that ideal. Let every action that I undertake be infused with mindfulness, consciousness of compassion and empathy, right? And this I think is a very powerful idea, right? When we think about both how we relate to ourselves and self-criticism, and how we relate to others, and whether being judgmental or being more empathic. And even when there is space for the side of deen, the side of judgment, or the side of severity, the key issue is let it always be coming from a place of love and compassion and empathy in a kind of larger sense, right? It's not to say, right, that we never could have severity or judgment or even be angry about anything, right? But the idea is perhaps echoing the rabbinic explanation for why the temple was destroyed. It was destroyed because of sinat chinam. It was destroyed because of baseless hatred. So in other words, though we should try, though these Kabbalists and others would argue, and even Maimonides, who disagrees with Aristotle, who said there are times for anger and there are times not for anger, right? Maimonides ultimately said anger is always bad, and the Kabbalists tried to walk this balancing act, but thinking for ourselves also, right? There may be times when these other elements of emotion and of action have their place, right? And there are, right? Certainly in the sense of kind of public moral outrage, right? That might be one powerful example of it for sure. But let it all be grounded in that empathy. Okay. You should let's read on for a little bit, and then maybe we'll pause for a little bit of Q&A. So we're going to try to do it that way. You should desire the well-being of your fellow creature, eyeing their good fortune benevolently. Let that person's honor be as precious to you as your own. And he did speak in the masculine terms, though I don't think he would necessarily exclude that from exclude a broader gender view, as it's a little bit more of a function of the nature of the Hebrew, but and other things for sure. So let that person's honor be as precious to you as your own. For you and your fellow are one and the same. That is why we are commanded, V'ahavta l're'echa kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself. You should desire what is right for your fellow, never denigrate them or wish for their disgrace. Just as God desires neither our disgrace nor our suffering because of our close relationship with God, So you should not desire someone else's disgrace, suffering, or ruin. You should feel as bad for such suffering as if it were your own, right? And this is actually coming, perhaps coming back a little bit to our opening kavanah, our opening reflection on what's going on in the world right now, right? I'm thinking about, well, what is it to try to cultivate empathy both in mind and heart, and then outwardly in action to the best that we are able to in our own circumstance, right? In terms of thinking about the suffering that's going on in the world, but this also applies at the very tactile level of interpersonal relationship, right? Between one person and another on a daily basis, right? How can we cultivate love your neighbor as yourself? How can we cultivate this virtue of love, this virtue of compassion, which are both emotions and ideals of the just, ideals of the good. So there's more to read and to say here, but I think now would probably be a good spot to pause for some questions, and I know that Master Ellie is going to or that Ellie is going to
gonna jump in.
Jump in. There you go.
I'm gonna jump in. So there are a number of questions, but I'm gonna start with the kind of basic and semantic ones, because I think we'll establish some ground, some kind of barriers here. The first is there have been some questions around just terminology, the difference between, say, compassion and Rachmanis you're using, Rachamim, is also a word for mercy. And are those two interchangeable, or is there a variation and separation between the two?
So yes, I think this is very significant. I tend to I tend to prefer to think about Rachamim more in terms of compassion and empathy than in terms of mercy. Mercy is is more of a power over terminology, right? Like, I hereby have mercy on you, right? Which to some extent, and actually, one of my favorite philosophers, Martha Nussbaum, as I mentioned before, also wrote a book on anger and forgiveness, and Moshe Halbertal has written about this as well, right? The question is, because the question of mercy implies a certain element of forgiveness, but from a place of hierarchy, right? So they're like, that it can have a kind of narcissistic, even hierarchical dimension, which is how Halbertal and Nussbaum talk about it, right? Like, I'm going to be so great in this moment, right? It's the opposite of what you want to be doing, that I'm going to have mercy on you, right? That's why I would prefer to render it, and I think that's really more at the heart of it. It sometimes has been translated as the 13 attributes of mercy, and I would suggest that's not the best translation. And I'm sorry, and Rachmanis, as you said, right, is that has that tone, that has that texture to it from the especially from the Yiddish adaptation of Rachmanis, right, is kind of like a kind of have pity upon, right, or have which is not what I think the virtue is calling for. So
in thinking about the Sfirot particularly, so Keter becomes this kind of all-inclusive emanation that includes compassion, love, but it's not necessarily stated in the same way that you would see Bina and the others that are kind of listed. But Keter is like, this is one of those questions that come up a couple of times. Wait, I don't see Rachamim in the Sfirot. It's engaged in that kind of bigger piece of Keter.
Yes. So of course we're I'm sure many are familiar with it. Many are familiar, many are unfamiliar with the structure of the Sfirot, and that's all good. By the way, a good kind of sketch of it is found at the beginning of the Essential Kabbalah volume by Daniel Madd, or at the beginning of the Pritzker edition of the Zohar. These are helpful diagrams, and it doesn't help things, or maybe it does help things, that Tiferet, which is right, the way the order of the Sfirot is in order to pass your doctoral exams, you have to be able to recite the Sfirot like over and over again very fast. No, I'm just kidding. But so Keter, Chochma, Bina, right? These are the top three, as you were mentioning, and then it goes to Chesed, Gevura, right? And this is kind of Chesed on the right side of God, right? Referring to kind of the loving right hand, right? They had it in for lefties, as did a lot of civilization. That's where sinister for left, right? But we love the right and the left. Well, okay, in this context, right? So we love it. Okay, so the specific point being that, right? Okay, so you have Chesed and Gevura, right and left, and then Tiferet is the balancing point in the middle, and that's also called Rachamim. So that that kind of confounds it. But there's kind of if you look at one of these diagrams, there's also a direct line of energy from Keter to Tiferet Rachamim, and Tiferet is understood as one of the great hearts of the Sfirot. So, but it's already a point that's lower down in where the purity of that divine energy flows into its multiple streams, like that image of this hidden mountain spring overflowing from the purest infinity of God into multiple rivulets and streams that are flowing down the mountain, right? Envisioning it that way, and then ultimately converging into rivers and lakes that eventually empty into the ocean. Kol hanachalim holchim el hayam, as Kohelet said, right? All the rivers run to the sea. But
so the connections are all there, whether it's the formulation it can be different.
Yeah.
I think if we have time for one more question in this block, and then
Sure.
There are a number of questions that have come up about this idea of the loving God in counter-distinction to the kind of picture of a jealous God, or a God who punishes wrongdoers, or an indifferent God, a God who can let horrific things happen all over the world. So this, how did the mystics, and maybe this is something that we'll get to a bit later, but is there a sense of how all of these different personifications of God come together, or is it just kind of that they live in separate spaces?
That's fantastic. It's fantastic and very important question, and I think there was a very important evolution in ways of understanding divinity from the time of ancient biblical Israel to modern theology, right, and everything in between. And here we're somewhere in between. But those they also couldn't get around the fact that there is also the vengeful, wrathful element of language of God, rhetoric of God, that is also part of that is also part of the Hebrew Bible and was used as a kind of, dare I say, kind of straw man by early Christianity, which were still Judeo-Christians, or Jews, right? Jews who for a long time who had this what came to be called the Christian bent, right, of a critique, and then ultimately a caricature of, oh, Jews are all about the wrathful God of the Old Testament, and Christianity is about the love of God. And as others have shown, I know that Shai Held is coming out with a book on this, and other people have written about it. I've written about it too. Is that to a great extent, even though that does exist, right, and those elements do exist within Judaism, and they exist in other ways within Christianity, and in other religions, they just take on different forms. The heart of it, and this text is an example of that. The heart of the ideal is to overcome that element of the harshness of divinity, which is also our own harshness, right? If we're emulating and we're trying to get beyond our own judgmentalism, our own harshness, our own severity, our own din, and to get back in touch with the purity of God's rachamim before there was any jealousy, any revenge, any anger, right? And so how can we it's almost like a kind of recalling of that purest of emotions, so that it can then guide us going forward. The question of how this relates to the idea of providence and divine omnipotence with regard to bad things that happen in the world, the classical text before some of these mystical texts that we're talking about, and mysticism itself and many others, have one set of answers to this, which include issues of so-called reward and punishment in ways that I think we would not resonate with, but I would say that especially in our context, it also behooves us to adjust that and to adapt that, right? So if I were speaking more in terms of constructive theology, right, and less in terms of just purely what the historical record shows, I would want to say that a God who controls everything and forgive the crudeness of this image, like a kind of grand puppeteer pulling the strings of everything, is not a theology that resonates with me, right? But it's also quite important to recognize that there have been many different theological views throughout the history of Judaism that can be, right, whether it be God as the one force of everything, and so forth, right? That's not to say that the idea of schar va'onesh, of reward and punishment, of divine omnipotence, of providence, isn't part of the history of Judaism, and it, right? I would be lying to you if I said that it isn't, right? But I think in terms of a contemporary theology that might be inspired by some of these sources, I would want to move away from that myself.
So let's keep going on the sources, and then we'll come back and for many more questions. But I know we want to get
terrific. So we were okay. We're sharing the great. So if we could just scroll down a little bit. Great. So okay. So God does not behave as a human being normally behaves. We'll come back to thinking about what that exactly means in a moment. If one person angers another, even after they are reconciled, the latter cannot bring themselves to love the one who offended them as he loved him before, Maybe, maybe not, right? Yet if you sin and then return to God, your status is higher, right? So as the saying goes, those who return to God occupy a place where even the completely righteous cannot stand. That's an allusion to the rabbinic statement that Ba'alei Teshuvah, right, those who return in repentance, have an even higher place in the hierarchy than the completely righteous, which is a very, very fascinating statement in the rabbinic context, and kind of drives home actually the idea that repentance and the ability to change is actually understood to be a highly revered ideal in the history of Jewish thought. All right. So in other words, you're not doomed, as it were, to just be dragged down by your mistakes, by our mistakes, but that teshuvah is always possible and is actually understood to be the greatest ideal. When you return to God and God restores the divine presence to you, His love for you is not the same as before, but all the greater. Okay. This is the meaning of. Let's go to the next page. Okay, you will again have compassion upon us. God will increase God's compassion, mending us, bringing us closer. Now, setting aside just some of the complexities of that for the moment, I just want us to look now at these next couple of paragraphs, which are really go to the heart of this question of our human emotion and how it is a spiritual ideal. This is how you should behave toward your fellow human being. Do not bear a grudge from the anger you felt, right? Easier said than done, right? When you see that this person wants to make up, be much more compassionate and loving than before. This is actually a kind of emulation of what we just saw, right? That when you want to make up with God, as it were, when you want to do teshuvah, right, then there should be even more rachamim sent out to you from God, or there is, and in this case, interpersonally, we should do that. We should do that too. Say to yourself, that person is like one of those who return to God, just like I was mentioning, right? Like about teshuvah, unrivaled by even the completely righteous, right? Even the greatest of the tzaddikim, even the greatest of the completely righteous, don't hold a candle to one who does teshuvah. Cultivate a more, because perhaps, right, one initial gesture in that direction is that because that requires a working on one's self, right? To do that, cultivate a more intimate relationship with that person than with those who have been completely righteous with you and have never offended you. That's not to say you shouldn't be nice to other people, right? It's just to say, right, how can you channel that? Okay, these are some of the qualities by which you resemble your Creator. The sublime qualities of compassion have a precious characteristic. Just as you conduct yourself below, that's to say in this world, so are you worthy of opening the corresponding sublime quality above. Right? This is a classic Kabbalistic idea that says that our actions in this world impact and influence and actually trigger an effect in the divine, right? It's kind of directly contra Maimonides and the Maimonideans, who said that, essentially say that God is ultimately too transcendent to and is ultimately totally transcendent, and therefore is indifferent because it's not possible for God to be in the same in the same zone. But however, in the Kabbalistic context, and this is sometimes called theurgy, right? This is the fancy term in the study of religion of impacting God, like metallurgy, like the shaping of metal, right? The impacting of God, the drawing down of energies, the healing of wounds that have been created within divinity, right? This is all part, right? Even within that totally perfect God, you might say, right, which is not something that some of the medieval philosophers like Maimonides would allow for. So, right, when there is brokenness, when there is woundedness and suffering in this world, then there is a kind of rupture within God's own self, right? Which you might find to be radical and even blasphemous, and I support that. I mean, I support the idea. So the idea being that God is actually reflective of our world, and so therefore we need to do a kind of tikkun, a kind of repair, right? This word tikkun, in the way that it came to be used in later contemporary social justice contexts, is really based indirectly on this Kabbalistic idea, right? Tikkun olam, repairing the world, really stems from Kabbalistic notions of tikkuna de'almin, which doesn't necessarily mean tikkun olam hazeh, the repair of this world, but it's about repair of the whole universe and repair of divinity and so forth. That's not to say that we shouldn't also do social justice in this world, right? That's also part of the picture. Okay, but the sublime qualities of compassion, just as you conduct yourself below, so too are you worthy, or so are you worthy of opening the corresponding sublime quality above. Exactly as you behave, so it emanates from above, right? And as you behave in this context we're seeing, right, and which has a certain moral inflection, is grounded in the emotion, right? Because the emotion of compassion, and in contrast, the emotion of judgment and severity, of feeling judgmental, and or the feelings that accompany severity. These are emotions that manifest in behavior in terms of our interpersonal relations with others. And then let's actually so God emanates compassion upon everything, and so too we should emulate this and send compassion to others. I want to skip actually to the bottom two lines here, and which will continue to onto the bottom lines here, which will continue onto the next page, because it very much relates to this, and also I think provides a very powerful potential meditative adaptation for a kind of calming exercise grounded in that has moral implications, and that is also deeply Kabbalistic in this particular way, right? Just as I said before, one needs to have compassion and calming within one's own self, and then one can project that toward other people, which is actually a core principle in Buddhist teachings, which have been adapted in contemporary mindfulness meditation as well, right? Self-compassion leads to outward directed compassion. Your forehead should not be tense at all, right? So I kind of, at this moment, I invite all of you to kind of become aware of your own forehead, and whether it's tense, whether it's crinkled in tension, or in stress, or in some resentment or in some judgmentalness or whatnot. Right, when we bring our attention to how we can relax the forehead, right, is actually a very, and he's going to say this also because the forehead is another term for keter. Okay, so as the forehead of the will, as he's going to say, right, is essentially a term for also for that highest sphera. So in other words, that relaxing of our actual physical countenance in that sense is a kind of embodied manifestation of cultivating that calmness and tranquility that can hopefully lead to a state of compassion as opposed to a state of anger. Right, so your forehead should not be tense at all, but rather always resemble the forehead of the will, metzach haratzon in the Hebrew, which is, as I said, a metaphor, a symbol for the highest sphera, which is both you might say anthropomorphic, or we are theomorphic, as I said before, but it's part of a whole cast of characters that make up the metaphors of this symbolic theological language. And you should do that so that you soothe everyone. So that you soothe everyone, right? You should relax your tension, and it's good for you too, right? And you're emulating God in that moment. That's the highest dimension of God. But then it also has this outward directed element of interpersonal relations, which also becomes a moral virtue to aspire to, right? To cause soothing to others, comfort, soothing, calming. And even if you come across angry people, soothe and calm them with your goodwill. For the forehead of the will constantly accepts and soothes the harsh powers, reintegrating them. This is actually very, so what he means Kabbalistically by this is that there are harsh powers within divinity, some of which have gone awry and become part of, let's say, the dark side of the Force, to use another Star Wars reference, or the demonic side, because I hate to break it to you, but pre-moderns very much believed in demons and the demonic, or maybe I don't hate to break it to you, right? That was actually just a part of their reality and belief. But here it's saying actually that keter, or this forehead of divinity, constantly takes in the harsh powers, or we might say, how, right, if we were to adapt this into a contemporary meditation, as we're sort of doing right now, right, how do we become aware of our feelings of harshness, or our feelings of tension that can become harshness and judgmentalness, and bring them back up into that soothing part of that tranquility, that compassion, to let it reintegrates it, or it calms it down, right? It brings it back to a soothing state, right? So in thinking about, let's say, an adapted type of meditation, we might say, if I'm feeling the upsurge of anger, or the upsurge of harshness, or the upsurge of judgmentalness, that I should focus on trying to reabsorb that emotion back into the soothing calmness of the forehead, right? Which should, and let my forehead relax, and think about that as a soothing process, and so that I can soothe the harshness, and hopefully that will make me more compassionate. So you should soothe those overwhelmed by anger. Induce them with goodwill, drawing on great wisdom to extinguish their anger before it transgresses the boundary and causes damage, God forbid. Model yourself on the will, right? Ratzon, again, this is, right, as I mentioned, we're still talking about Keter here, the highest Sphirot. These are, Keter, each of the Sphirot have many different names. Which emanates from the wondrous wisdom in the forehead of the Ancient One, from where it soothes everything, right? So the idea of the Ancient One, the Atika Kadisha, the Holy Ancient One, or the Metzach HaRatzon, the forehead of the will, all of this is ultimately this first Sphira, where the source of all rachamim, the source of all compassion, empathy, love, and the source of all soothing, too. Derive the power to be genial with others. If your character is somewhat harsh, people will not be soothed. If your character is somewhat harsh, people will not be soothed. And you won't be soothed yourself. That is why the Mishnah teaches, if the spirit of people delights in someone, so does the spirit of God. I'll just mention these other couple of lines here, and then maybe we'll go to some more discussion, question and response, or call and response, as it sometimes is called in kirtan. Okay, that's a little bit of a tangent. Your ears should always be tuned to hear the good, while rumors and gossip should never be let in. According to the secret of sublime listening. According to the secret of sublime listening. This is fascinating, I think. Right? So in other words, it's like, it's not only just how to be a good listener in terms of actually listening to someone, but it's about how do I try to focus on hearing the good in things, as opposed to letting in these destructive forces of rumors and gossip. There, no harsh shouting enters. Right? And we should all be so blessed as to always be so tranquil and to never let the shouting in and so forth, right? Because we're human beings, but this is still an ideal that we want to strive toward. No tongue of evil leaves a blemish, right? Meaning lashon hara, right? A kind of negative speech about someone else leaves a blemish. So listen only to the positive, useful things, not to things that provoke anger. So let's pause there for a moment, I think, for our second round of some Q&A. And so I turn it over to Ellie.
So I think, that question, even in that moment of sitting there very intently with my forehead furrowed, and then you say, no, smooth out your forehead. And I'm like, oh, that does just immediately make me feel a little calmer. What is that I'm putting out into the universe? And I think that idea of self-regulation is so interesting, of how we reflect things back. And interesting that they would put a divine note on that, because that seems outside of the realm of divine. So I think there's some questions that are going on about the sense of our God self and human. Is there a way that, are these parallel? Is this so oppositional and yet aspirational? Kind of the relationship, the way that, we inhabit our bodies and we live in our bodies and we act in our bodies, and God as a divine form and being. And actually, while we're on this, clarifying that God is the ancient one as referenced to in that statement, is there kind of this sense that this is all aspirational, or is this a sense that this is God, it's God and God's self?
So I want to just say yes, but I think I need to be a little bit more complex. No, no. So very important. So yes, but when we're talking about all of these different qualities, like ancient one and so forth, or the forehead of the will, all of this is part, for the Kabbalists, is all part of the one God. It's all part of the one God. And here we're talking about one aspect, this highest aspect of the one God, which is Keter, which is the forehead of the will, which is the ancient one. And on the one hand, it is aspirational, right? Because we are striving to attain this higher, better version of ourselves, right? But in their view, that is an aspiration to act like God, right? To emulate God, right? That God is perhaps, right, is better able to do this, right? Or God exemplifies this in a kind of ideal way, and and that our actions here below in the world are earthly, worldly embodiments of that divine reality in their view, right? So that there again is that idea of theomorphic, right, as opposed to anthropomorphic, right? We might say, well, wait a minute, God is a forehead. I thought that God didn't have a body. So right. So and those are totally understandable reactions, though there are a lot of different answers to this throughout the tradition. And as I said, the Kabbalists spoke very much in terms of a kind of divine body that is not a body as we know it. Okay, but spoken embodied, gendered, sexualized terms, in a very bold, mythic way that in some ways was also a kind of response to the legacy of Maimonides and other philosophers. But in this sense, right, it's theomorphic as opposed to anthropomorphic. We're not, in their view, we're not projecting our anthropic, our humanness and human body onto God. Of course, we're going to be manifestation. Of course, our human bodies and our human emotions are going to be lower reverberations of God if we are B'Tselem Elohim, right? We are like the form of God. We are like the manifestation of God. We are theomorphic. And the idea of trying to act in a way, as he said, right, imitate your creator or emulate your creator, is a modality of trying to aspire toward that aspirational ideal, which is always the case in any kind of statement of intention of prayer, or I should have this kind of concentration, or I should study Torah in this way, or I should cultivate this kind of emotional practice. These are fundamentally prescriptive ideals in that sense, right? That I'm trying to work toward a certain higher ideal. But nevertheless, right, it's saying that we as human beings are earthly, lower manifestations of that divinity, right? And the idea is, how do I live a life that is emotionally, spiritually, morally grounded in my Tselem Elohim, in my being the image of God? And he says that doesn't just mean, right, what our bodies look like, right? It's what our character is, really, right? And it's what kinds of emotions we let dominate. It's about how we then let those emotions turn into moral practice. So in this sense, it's saying, okay, when I think about the relaxing of the forehead, I'm kind of channeling, if you will, that relaxing, that soothing, relaxing tranquility of divinity that absorbs all harshness, and let me be a channel for that into the world.
Okay. I know we have a little bit of a time crunch, so there's so many questions, but I know there's also a lot more within the sources. So do we want to turn back and or do you want to?
Let's do another question. We don't have to get to everything in the sources.
Okay. So the questions emerged about this concept of, that if you return, if you do teshuvah, that you actually are closer to God than if you were just always there. And that seems like almost permission to behave badly so that you can then, be even closer because you're returning to God. Is there any kind of sense of that, or a negative that's placed on that? Perhaps just always going down the path that you should go on is the way to go, as opposed to being someone who's returning.
Yes. So philosophically, that certainly would be a legitimate critique, right? Sort of saying, if I wanted to game the system, right, then I could, I could say, okay, well, let me go wayward for a little while, and then I'm going to come back into teshuvah, and then I'll really beat those tzaddikim. But I think that part of where this really comes from is a kind of hope, an attempt to give a hopeful message, right? It's to try to say that, those people who are going to be able to be like completely perfect tzaddikim are few and far between, if they really exist at all. Right. To some extent, I would say we're all Baalei Teshuvah, right? You could say it's a Baalei Teshuvah in the sense of like in terms of halachic practice that's sometimes talked about that way, but that's not really what it's talking about here, right? It's talking about more that, well, we're always on this path of figuring out our way, and each of us slips up, and each of us falls down on the job, as it were, right? And that's part of our humanity, part of our finitude, and so our task is to always be on the path toward teshuvah, always working on ourselves. And that's what I think that they're both the rabbis of old and Cordovero of old, but more recent,
less old,
a little less old, was trying to state. Yeah.
Do you want to go back? Do you want to kind of finish up with any of the sources, and then we'll wrap up? Or
yeah, let me just.
One person asks if this is just kind of the mystical equivalent of anger management or Dear Abby or Ann Landers, in popular, which I like the vision of, the mystical Dear Abby.
The mystical Dear Abby, or the mystical anger management. I think you could say there's an element of that. I mean, there are also rabbinic statements and mystical statements that also say that when anger takes hold of a person, that they rip a part of their own soul, and that they commit a kind of idolatry, right? So there are a lot of different statements going on, but I think it's related to certain types of mindfulness meditation inspired by Buddhist teaching, which understand tranquility, enlightenment, and the cultivation of what Buddhists call an attitude of gratitude and loving kindness, which is also articulated in the Jewish tradition as well, right? Which stems from the ability to cultivate that compassion and tranquility in ourselves. I think that what's particularly powerful about this is it's also not just it's not just the human process in and of itself, but it's about how do I bring God into the world, right? How do I bring God into the world? And one of the core ways that it is saying that is a kind of meditation on how there are these different dimensions of divinity, and that ultimately God is animated by this root source of rachamim and love, and that our goal should be to manifest that in both in terms of the calming of the forehead, and also right, as a mode of then both calming oneself down and radiating that out to others. I wanted to just look quickly at in the passages from the Shnei Luchot Habrit, the first passage. If we could bring that one up, because it's dealing with something a little bit different. It's essentially about the question of ve'ahavta, right? The command, if you will, or the imperative to love, which manifests in a number of different ways in the Torah, right? Whether it be ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, you shall love the Lord your God, or ve'ahavta l're'echa kamocha, right? You shall you shall love your neighbor, your fellow as yourself, and then also ve'ahavtem et hager, right? And you shall love the stranger, or right, which manifests in a number of different ways, but perhaps it's also a kind of command to love and show empathy to the refugee, right, as is manifest in our own moment in time. So I'm looking at this top passage, and the Hebrews on the left, my translations. I mean, Hebrews on the right, my translations on the left. This is from Shnei Luchot Habrit, 2 tablets of the covenant, as I mentioned, by Isaiah Horowitz. The Shnei Luchot Habrit is a massive 7-volume work that both anthologizes and brings together tons of different texts, but is a kind of combination of Kabbalistic ethics, theology, but also all kinds of things related to Talmudic sources and interpretations of the holidays. It's an extremely voluminous work by a very important thinker, late 16th century, early 17th century, eventually land of Israel, though he was in Poland and in Prague at different times as well as a rabbinic leader. You shall love the Lord your God, right? This is from the Shema, right? And it is also written, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Behold, from Leviticus 19, you shall behold, these two loves are joined and united through the oneness of God. Be he blessed. Kadosh Baruch Hu. Right? Hine mechubarot elu shtei ahavot. Right? These two loves, the imperative to love God and the imperative to love your fellow human being, are one. They are united. For thus do we conclude, and for this reason do we conclude the blessings of the Shema with the words, he who chooses his people, Israel, with love. Habocher Amo Yisrael be'ahava. And he who loves his people, ve'ohev Amo Yisrael. Right, these are all part of the larger blessings for the Shema, and utter the verse of unity, right? Ohev Amo Yisrael, right, is at the end of right. These are the end of Ahava Rabbah, right? Before the actual recitation of the Shema, and then say the verse of unity. That is to say, the actual Shema. That God is one. After this, an exclamation of the love of God, and then after that, this exclamation of V'ahavta Adonai Elohecha, right? In the V'ahavta, right? He's talking about the blessings before of and the language before in the V'ahavta, in the Ahava Rabbah, and then the Shema itself, the rest of that line of proclamation recitation, and then the V'ahavta, right? It's kind of that the Shema is the middle part of this sandwich of love, right? of the love before and the love after, and also the Ten Commandments also conclude with the words, that which belongs to your neighbor. As a kind of imperative. So kind of drawing forth the lessons of this statement, and then also seeing it as to how it relates to our larger theme that we explored through Cordovero. There is a kind of dynamic interrelationship between how we relate in love to God and receive God's love, and how we enact love toward other people, right? And if he's specifically saying that these two loves are one, that ahavta et Adonai Elohecha and ahavta l'recha kamocha, and part of V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, I think we would extend to V'ahavtem et hager. That's an enormously powerful statement, right? In the sense of saying that to show love to another person is nothing less than to enact your love of God, and to express your love of God. To enact V'ahavta l'recha kamocha and V'ahavtem et hager is V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, and they are both in the imperative. They are both in this exhortation, right? So tying it together with the Cordovero, it's about bringing these different aspects of a loving heart and a compassionate heart together, such that my connection to God manifests and flows through me and outward through me to those with whom I interact, right? And certainly it's aspirational, right? We would all be tzaddikim if we could always do this, right? But thankfully, there's room for all of us to be baalei teshuvah, and that should be our goal.
I don't know if you have time for one question here.
Sure, absolutely.
As we're finishing up, there's kind of this sense of, yes, love is this great aspiration, but what do we do with the people? And going back to our kind of opening kavanah around Ukraine and like Putin in the world, like how do we respond to those sorts of, people with malicious intent or who seem not to bring love into this world? What are the ways in which we relate to them?
I think that I don't have an easy answer to that, but I would say that part of channeling love and compassion and empathy in a larger sense sometimes means that it requires fighting for the good, right? Sometimes it means standing up to forces of destruction and hatred and harm, right? So it's not so much that I should try to see the good, that I should just try to see the good in the person who does evil, right? I mean, I think that there's a kind of spectrum of this, right? But in this sense, I would say that in that kind of larger scale, where we're talking about the events of today and the events of the past, right? Whether it be other evil figures of history or of today, it's perhaps a way to reframe it is that how can I channel my larger kavanah, my larger intention toward compassion and empathy and love, in this case, toward all the people who are harmed by that destruction, and that therefore need also the midat hadin, if you will, right? The attribute of strength and severity and fighting back in certain respects, right? Or sometimes quite literally, for the sake of that larger ethics of care. What we do at the individual interpersonal level when we're dealing with individuals who may be exhibiting some of those, right? I think that there are certain red lines, you could say, in correlation to that, right? But how do we relate interpersonally to other people? It's essentially to say that at least at the individual level, it's more effective to be a soother than to be a rebuker, right? Or to up the ante, right?
Well, thank you so much, Eitan. This was really lovely. We really appreciate your sharing with us. And this idea of love and compassion, I think, are so important in this moment. And it's so easy to respond in anger and acrimony. And it's just even that kind of practical advice, like I feel it already, like, the cultivating that sense of soothing, I hope is something that I can do in the world. And I hope it's something that our participants will take with us today from this session.
Really.
So coming up, we have next week on March 21st, we are engaging with Rabbi Michal Springer. She's going to be addressing loneliness as a spiritual crisis, which I think in many ways will build on this question of compassion and rachamim, and certainly is one of the major concerns that has come out of pandemic. She is the manager of clinical and pastoral education at NYU, New York Presbyterian Hospital in New York City, and she's an adjunct professor with JTS. So we hope you'll come back again next Monday at 2:00, and you'll be getting the link as always. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we will see you again next time.
Take care, everybody.